Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Gardiner Harris. First name is Gardiner, and last name is Harris, Harris. He's just published a book, and if you're watching this on X, Rockfin, or Rumble, you will see the cover. It's No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson and Johnson. And there's a lot to this story. This is like one of our biggest companies in the United States, and there's a lot to go, a lot to discuss about this book. I don't know if we'll be able to get into all of it in 40 minutes or 45 minutes, but he is a consultant. He lives in Southern California. From 2003 to 2019, he worked at the New York Times, serving as an international diplomacy, White House, South Asia, public health, and pharmaceutical reporter. His stories in South Asia about air pollution led to profound changes to ameliorate the problem, and his pieces on sanitation helped inspire the government to build more than 1 million toilets. He was also a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He investigated the Securities and Exchange Commission that led to criminal charges against top executives. He also worked out of the Courier Journal of Louisville, Kentucky. And in 1999, he won the Worth Bingham Prize for investigative journalism and the George Polk Award for environmental reporting, after revealing that coal companies deliberately and illegally exposed miners to toxic levels of coal dust. And he's also written a novel titled Hazard about his experience investigating these conditions, but he can talk more about that. So Gardiner Harris, welcome to the show.
William, I'm thrilled to be here.
Excellent. So for people who haven't heard your name, maybe not this book, maybe you can talk about your long career, your research. I know the intro you talk about this interesting exchange you had from somebody from a pharmaceutical company. Maybe that's a good place to start, and then your research on what led to writing No More Tears.
Sure. I mean, William, I love your podcast and the fact that you do a lot of true crime. And what this book is really about is the largest, costliest, and deadliest criminal conspiracies in American history, and nothing else is close. And Johnson & Johnson was the central actor in these criminal conspiracies that cost at least 2 million Americans their lives. So your focus really on crime is exactly the right one. In fact, when I was in Louisville working for the Courier Journal, I was the cop reporter. I did stories on crime, murders, dead bodies, headless corpses found, all that sort of stuff. And the color of that kind of crime and that kind of crime writing is kind of what I try to bring to this book about Johnson & Johnson, which, I basically liken to a criminal enterprise. That there was a time when 6 out of 7 of Johnson & Johnson's top selling drugs basically were marketed using criminal means. Mafia families get a larger share of their revenue from purely legal enterprises than Johnson & Johnson did during the height of its criminality. And the book really is intended to help people navigate their own healthcare and that of their children and their parents, because the fact of the matter is that the United States healthcare system is shot through with corruption and corrupt actors. Even people you think you can trust and that you should trust, you really need to be careful with them. And so what I'm trying to do is, by looking at Johnson & Johnson, which is by far the most important healthcare products company in the world, is one of maybe 2 of the most important healthcare companies in the American healthcare system, the other one being United Healthcare Group, the insurance giant. What's important about looking at Johnson & Johnson is to see how the system fails you and how you can sort of take back control for yourself and your family. And that's why I basically tell the story of 9 separate products, baby powder and Tylenol, 2 of the most important consumer healthcare products. I tell those stories and why those products have been so deadly for so long, and how the company managed to persuade so many of us. Half of all babies in the 20th century had their bottoms dusted with Johnson's baby powder. Tylenol is by far and away the most widely used drug in the world. And yet both are far more dangerous than people know. And Johnson & Johnson has managed that in an extraordinary way. And then I tell the story about prescription medicines. The first being Procrit, a blood thickener that Johnson & Johnson sold to cancer patients despite knowing that it would lead cancer tumors to grow. It kept that information secret, and it managed to pay off nearly everyone in the cancer world so that they would keep quiet too. And roughly 500,000 cancer patients died in that disaster that almost no one knows about, William.
Wow,
The second
I've never heard that.
Right. The second disaster is the Risperdal disaster, and that's really goes on right now. 60,000 Americans die every year because they are inappropriately given Risperdal and similar medicines, mostly in American nursing homes. At least 1 million people have died because of Johnson & Johnson's criminal activity and those of other companies competing with Johnson & Johnson. And that is by far the largest public health emergency in American history. My former colleagues at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal often talk about the opioids crisis being the worst public health disaster ever. It is not. It's not even close. It's the antipsychotic crisis. And there's a real COVID piece to that as well that we can talk about. And then I also talk about the opioids crisis. William, most of the country believes that Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers were by far and away the guilty parties on the opioid crisis. And in fact, there's a whole host of Netflix shows, documentaries, there's a library of books on opioids that focus exclusively on the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma. In fact, Johnson & Johnson was probably even more to blame for the crisis than they. During the height of the opioid crisis, around 20% of the bodies that showed up in morgues had a Purdue Pharma product in their system. More than 60% had a J&J product in their system. And you have to ask yourself, William, why don't you know that? Why doesn't the rest of the country know that? Why has Purdue Pharma been the almost exclusive target of stories about the opioid crisis? So then I move from those drugs to medical devices. And the first medical device I talk about is the Pinnacle metal-on-metal hip implant. And Johnson & Johnson sold this hip implant even though it knew that its product was exactly like previous implants that had been withdrawn in the 60s and 70s because they were incredibly dangerous and poisoned patients with a vast amount of metal filings, because the metal components of these hip implants rubbed against each other and created this cesspool of toxic metal ions that destroyed the tissue around it and poisoned patients' brains, leading them to blindness and other things. And they did this knowingly and deliberately. And then I talk about vaginal mesh, which was this product that Johnson & Johnson sold to older women who experience prolapse, which half of older women do. Prolapse is when the incredible flexibility that women have in giving birth kind of works against them in older age when their internal organs start to sag and start pressing on their vagina and on their bladders. And that's why older women have trouble with incontinence and often trouble even with vaginal sex. And Johnson & Johnson sold them this plastic mesh that the company knew before selling it would lead a third of the recipients to never be able to have vaginal sex again. It was an extraordinary disaster that ruined the lives of hundreds of thousands of women across the world. And Johnson and Johnson knew this would happen before it even started, and in fact was so troubled by what it knew, it didn't even seek FDA approval. It ended up just selling this device in the United States and around the world without the FDA really even knowing it. And then finally, I tell the story of the COVID-19 vaccine project, which, you know, had all kinds of problems from the very get-go. The company knew that this vaccine would probably create a blood disorder, a clotting situation where you both clotted too much and you bled too much. Those are normally opposite reactions, and Johnson and Johnson's vaccine created both at the same time, which meant when patients showed up in hospitals, doctors had no idea how to treat them, because you either treat them to increase the clotting or you treat them to increase the bleeding, but you can't treat them to do both. So again and again and again, this company has done the wrong thing. And what's fascinating, sort of my secondary target in the book, is the FDA, and how the FDA not only allowed all this to happen, but in some cases quietly enabled it and ended up coming to Johnson and Johnson's defense. And then finally, the third target is the American professional class, because none of this would have been possible if not for thousands of doctors, lawyers, academics, and even journalists turning a blind eye and in some cases quietly helping these efforts. And that's why I call them the largest criminal conspiracies, because the number of co-conspirators in each of these cases often numbered in the thousands.
It's incredible. I mean, we're the sickest we've ever been, probably, as a people, and you can blame Johnson and Johnson and its products in part. And it's really incredible because I mean, this book is so timely because so much is going on. I think they appointed a new head of the FDA,
Right.
and
Just
there's yesterday, and he's making changes,
he
kicking
is.
people out. So like, this book couldn't be on like a better time for somebody to read it. But the interesting thing, also, the cover is perfect too, because I think almost every household had this powder, baby powder, in their cabinet. Like, I just remember growing up with it. It was very much like a cure-all for whatever. I mean, golfers used it or whatever. Like, it wasn't just for babies, but it's just really amazing that. And then there was lawsuits on this alone, this baby powder for cancer.
Sure. And
Yeah, I mean,
Johnson and Johnson set $10 billion aside to try to resolve these claims. In fact, Johnson and Johnson is in many ways a law firm with a drug and a device company attached. The company has spent $35 billion since 2011 just on lawyers, and because it has been sued by hundreds of thousands of people over countless products, and no other company in American history has come close to spending that amount of money on lawyers and settlements. And what's interesting about you saying your familiarity with Johnson's baby powder is that in many ways it was Johnson's baby powder that really led to the downfall of Johnson and Johnson. And it's baby powder that really protected Johnson and Johnson from the effects of all this, because Johnson's baby powder has the most recognized fragrance in the world. And so we're all, more than half of American babies had their bottoms dusted with Johnson's baby powder. And when that happened, when you're a baby and your mom comes to you and wipes your bottom clean and coos to you and caresses you, it's the best thing that happens to you as a baby, right? That and being breastfed. Those are the two great things. And when you were being cleaned, you smelled this iconic smell of Johnson's baby powder. So from birth, basically, you associated this smell with one of the best things that happened to you, with the trust and love you have with your mother. And that then is inculcated into you. And William, that the smell center in the brain and the emotional center in the brain are right next door to each other. And that's why when you smell a very familiar smell from your childhood, it triggers memories like nothing else. So that's what Johnson's baby powder has done for Johnson and Johnson. It has infused this company with this sort of sense of trust and love. And in fact, for decades, Johnson and Johnson executives would start most of their speeches by saying, when I say Johnson's baby powder, how many of you can just smell it? And the entire room would light up, and it had this almost hypnotic effect
Wow.
on the audience. And whatever the executives then said would have this extraordinary receptive audience. And that's basically, that receptivity was a shield to Johnson and Johnson against all of its subsequent criminal activity.
Wow, it's just incredible. It's a huge company. It's almost like that same model these other companies have where they know that they're going to pay out over time, but they're so big, it's just part of the business plan. Like I think their market cap, I was just checking, is $350 billion. It's bigger than like the output of some countries in the world. Like it's just incredibly huge with this really nice propaganda arm or public relations arm or whatever you want to call it. When you have this many problems, it's something else. It's interesting that it ties into the FDA. Can you talk about Johnson and Johnson is a 19th century company, so it's before all of these big administrative bodies, right?
Yeah, Johnson and Johnson was there at the birth of the FDA, and in fact, some of its early products used the Red Cross symbol. And they sold bandages around the world with the Red Cross symbol on it. Now, once the Red Cross got going internationally, there are international treaties that forbid anyone from using the Red Cross. In fact, if I had put a Red Cross on my book, I almost certainly would have gotten a letter from the Red Cross citing these international treaties and telling me that they would take me to court and successfully take me to court to make sure that I got rid of that symbol. There is only one organization outside of the Red Cross that can use that symbol, and that's Johnson and Johnson, because Johnson and Johnson got special legislation passed by Congress in the 19th century that gave it the sole right to use the Red Cross symbol, and it still does. It is, and in fact, the Red Cross and Johnson have been in quiet legal wars over the years ever since. But basically, Johnson and Johnson, what happened is that in the late 1980s, you may remember, William, during the AIDS crisis, AIDS advocates really turned their ire onto the FDA because they said the FDA was too slow in approving products. They also turned their ire on the NIH and Tony Fauci there. And they actually threw blood on the FDA headquarters walls because the FDA didn't have enough money to do its examinations of new drugs in any kind of timely manner. And in fact, it was at that point that delays between the application and approval were getting upwards of 2 years. And so David Kessler, the commissioner at the time, made a telling and what turned out to be terrible decision, which is he knew Congress was not going to give him the money to get out of this dilemma. So he turned to the industry and asked the industry to start paying the FDA directly if the FDA promised the industry that they would give much more rapid approval times. Now, each one of those agreements with the industry is a 5-year agreement. The first one was in 92 under Kessler, then the next in 97 and on and on. But with each agreement, the industry got the FDA to sell bigger and bigger and bigger parts to itself. And one of the biggest moments came in 2012 when the industry basically said, we're done. We're not paying anymore. We're not getting enough out of this. And the FDA commissioner at the time, Margaret Hamburg, called up the man who would soon be leading Johnson & Johnson, Alex Gorski, and said, help, we're in trouble. We need the industry to agree to give us these fees, or the FDA, hundreds and hundreds of FDA medical officers will be fired. and Alex Gorsky rallied, put together an agreement, and used Johnson & Johnson's vast lobbying force to get Congress to approve it. And FDA from there on out owed Johnson & Johnson big. And FDA subsequently basically let them off the hook on vaginal mesh, let them off the hook on metal implants. They were right then being investigated for their criminal conspiracy around Risperdal that has cost more than 1 million lives. And surprise, surprise, prosecutors decided not to prosecute any individual executive in that case. And so and then FDA started issuing letters to help Johnson & Johnson in its lawsuits. Just out of the blue, for instance, when Johnson & Johnson lost its first baby powder case, within months, the FDA released a letter saying that baby powder is safe, even though Johnson & Johnson had not given the FDA a single test of its baby powder, hundreds of which had shown that there was asbestos contamination. The Johnson & Johnson had not given a single test to the FDA since 1973. So even though the FDA knew almost nothing about the real safety of Johnson's baby powder, they released a statement saying it's safe. And those statements to this day have been Johnson & Johnson's most valuable and most oft-cited defense in its baby powder litigation.
Wow. What a great racket. Like, the other thing is the public doesn't know a lot of this inside baseball stuff. Like, it's incredible. Like, they've gotten away with it for years. And people like, something's really wrong going on. It's a great deal for Johnson & Johnson.
Oh boy. And one of the stories that I'm sure you have heard, and everyone who has ever gone to business school or communication school, the first thing they are taught, if you go to Harvard Business School or you go to the Wharton School, the first day of class, you are going to be given a case study on the 1982 Tylenol poisoning crisis, right? Where, Tylenol capsules contaminated with cyanide showed up on in Chicago and ended up killing. The official number is 7. The likely number, the unofficial number is 11. It's likely there were many, many, many more other deaths, but you're going to be given this case study that says that Johnson & Johnson's reaction to this crisis set the model, was the most ethical response to a corporate crisis in history, and it should be followed. But what you will not learn is that Johnson & Johnson almost certainly was illegally paying off the FDA commissioner at the time, that Johnson & Johnson likely knew who the actual murderer was, and that person was actually in Johnson & Johnson's distribution network. They kept all of that secret. So the real lesson that business students should be taught is that if you lie, dissemble, and pay off the right people, you'll actually get away with it. Whereas, the lesson that they're actually being taught is honesty will rule the day.
They supposedly, their response was to take all the Tylenol off the shelves at a great loss. I think you wrote $100 million or something like that, and say, we're going to set everything straight. And that was part of their great PR, right? I didn't know. I remember how much that was in the news. It's probably before some people's time who were listening to this, but it was really all over American news. Was this?
It was the most covered event since the JFK assassination, almost 20 years before. So there were more than 100,000 separate stories on that contamination episode. And, the proof of just how extraordinarily effective their PR efforts were was that Johnson & Johnson is basically, it calls itself a family of companies. It has hundreds of subsidiaries. And the company has been very effective at, when there's bad news, using the name of the subsidiary and blaming the subsidiary. And when there's good news, using the Johnson & Johnson emblem. So in the first week of the Tylenol poisoning scare, the name that was used as the maker of Tylenol was McNeil Healthcare Labs, which is the subsidiary that makes Tylenol. Within a little more than a week, Johnson & Johnson started adding its own brand to their press releases. And then after a little more than 2 weeks, they dropped McNeil Labs altogether and just used Johnson & Johnson, which is why, you can see this with Tylenol. When people think about the 1982 Tylenol poisoning scare, they think about Johnson & Johnson. But 30 years later in 2010, when Johnson & Johnson got caught by the FDA knowingly producing more than 100 million bottles of contaminated Tylenol and other products, the company insisted that reporters use McNeil Healthcare as the maker of Tylenol. And in fact, I was a reporter at the New York Times at the time, and I remember arguing with representatives of Johnson & Johnson and say, wait a second, when you talk about 1982, the company that made Tylenol in 1982 was Johnson & Johnson. And now that the news is bad, you're insisting that we say the maker of Tylenol is McNeil Healthcare. And they, of course, straight-faced said, yes, absolutely, and argued with my editor. And we ended up, like most reporters, when we got that kind of pushback, we sort of buckled. It is a measure of the genius of Johnson & Johnson and its PR apparatus that, William, almost none of these stories.
I don't. I thought that he was never caught, that the perp, they had a guy, but somebody was never arrested and prosecuted. Is that correct?
So the FBI identified a guy from Boston who sent a letter to McNeil sort of saying, if you don't pay me $1 million, I'll keep doing this. Now, that guy almost certainly had nothing to do with the poisoning. He was in Boston. There was no evidence that he'd been in Chicago. But the FBI has never released its files on its investigation. And the likely reason is that they completely botched the investigation. And they wanted this guy Lewis in Boston to be the perpetrator, because if it was a crime that took a place across state lines, then the FBI, could be in charge of the investigation. But the real perpetrator was probably a guy, a man I talk about in the book, Roger Arnold, who worked within Johnson & Johnson's distribution network and who had access to entire pallets of Tylenol. There are lots of proof here, but I'll tell you one thing I don't really talk about in the book, William, is that, in 4 years later in 1986, there was a second poisoning with Tylenol. And in this case, this came even after there had been 3 seals added to the Tylenol bottles. Right. And, Johnson & Johnson never really explained how it was possible that someone could defeat those seals and still poison people with cyanide. And so it really raises a question as to whether, there were 2 possible explanations that were never explored and never publicized. One is that this Roger Arnold guy was the likely perpetrator, and there are 3 police detectives that in Chicago who to this day believe he was the guy. And the other is that Johnson & Johnson itself had a poisoner at one of its plants. And that's why it happened again in 1986. Now, the FDA completely dismissed this possibility almost immediately, but the FDA commissioner at the time, Arthur Hayes Jr., was just left his job as commissioner because it turned out he was taking money from the pharmaceutical industry. Now, we've never found out precisely who was paying him, but as soon as he left the agency, he essentially went to work for Johnson & Johnson. So it's a good guess that the company that was paying him was also the company that benefited so much when he instantly absolved Johnson & Johnson of responsibility in the 1982 case.
So that revolving door goes back decades. So it didn't start recently. It's incredible. Like, I didn't know that. For people who don't know too, this was the beginning of, like, that poisoning was when all these products got wrapped and seals and all that stuff. They didn't have that before.
No, and that was a really good outcome from that. I don't. I mean, in the Tylenol case, they did end up withdrawing, all bottles, spending a lot of money, as much as $100 million relaunching. So I don't want to suggest that all of their actions in that 82 case were terrible. But the other story about Tylenol, we all know Tylenol because of this extraordinary and expensive marketing campaign that it's the pain reliever doctors use the most, it's the pain reliever hospitals use the most, all that sort of stuff. And that advertising campaign suggests that Tylenol is uniquely safe. In fact, Tylenol is by far the most dangerous over-the-counter medicine in the United States, and nothing else is close. And in fact, you can add up all the deaths from all other over-the-counter remedies, and they will not come close to the deaths that come from Tylenol. And part of the reason for that is this pretty false campaign that Tylenol is uniquely safe. And in fact, this is where you also see the relationship between Johnson & Johnson and the FDA being so close and so inappropriate, because over many decades, there were FDA advisory committees that told the FDA in no uncertain terms, you have to increase the warnings on the Tylenol bottle because so many people are dying. And this is particularly true with extra strength Tylenol, which I will not let into my house. But the FDA demurred, refused again and again and again and again. And this was particularly true in infants. And I talk about how many infants died because Johnson & Johnson had two strengths of their pediatric Tylenol formulations. One, a concentrated version for infants, and the other, a less concentrated version for children. And people would mix them up, and infants and children died again and again and again until finally in 2011, Johnson & Johnson decided to just sell one formulation. But up until that time, the company acknowledged in court that they saw those infant deaths as just a cost of doing business.
Wow, it's disturbing. It's acetaminophen. So if you take too much Tylenol over time, it basically causes liver disease, right?
It's the most common reason for liver failure in the United States.
Wow, is this?
And Tylenol is the only over-the-counter remedy, the only over-the-counter drug where the recommended dose and the maximum dose are the absolute same. So the problem is that the medicine inside Tylenol, as you said, is acetaminophen, but acetaminophen is in so many other products, like, a lot of the cough and cold medicines that you get on pharmacy shelves have acetaminophen in them. So what people do is they start feeling flu-like symptoms or cold or something. They'll take Tylenol, and then they'll take, in addition to that, a flu remedy that has acetaminophen in it. And the problem is that the symptoms of Tylenol poisoning mimic the symptoms of the flu. So you start feeling even more lousy. You think it's because you have the flu. You take even more Tylenol and this flu remedy with acetaminophen in it, and you get even more poisoned. And by the time anyone realizes what's going on, it's too late. Your liver is dead, and you either get a liver transplant or in too many cases, people simply die. And this risk has been known since extra strength Tylenol was approved in 1976. And in fact, there is, the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, has said, and others have said, that acetaminophen probably would not be approved if it were to come before the FDA today. The only reason it's still being sold is that it was approved back in 1960.
There's whole shelves at certain pharmacies or Walgreens of different varieties of Tylenol. It's terrifying when you think about it. Like, wow, this is a really dangerous kind of substance.
And the reason why they went for the extra strength is it's not terribly effective. So you kind of have to go for the really strong version, but that strong version puts you at risk for catastrophe. And, people who drink alcohol, and I'm just talking about normal amounts of alcohol, are at particularly high risk. And I'm not saying, drink alcohol while taking Tylenol. I mean, if you just drink alcohol in your life and then get sick, stop drinking alcohol and take Tylenol, you are much more likely to suffer a terrible liver problem than someone who drinks no alcohol.
Wow. Yeah, crazy. Be careful out there, folks. One of the things you mentioned at the intro, you mentioned the FDA, but also, and it's on your cover here, is the deception, corruption, and death. It's the kind of subversion or undercutting of all these other professional doctors, lawyers, and other people, like giving cash to doctors and stuff. That was one of the main things in the opioid crisis, but it didn't just apply to opioids, right?
No, it applies across the board, William. And this is why this book, it's really about the corruption of American healthcare, which, as you know, is 18% of the American GDP. I mean, there is a reason that we spend more than twice as much on healthcare on a per capita basis as any other country, and we have worse healthcare outcomes. And that's because our system is so corrupt. And in fact, William, there is every reason to believe that our system is getting more and more corrupt, that it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And I walk through the many ways this happened. Probably the story that really shows this is the EPO story. EPO, people know about EPO. It's called Procrit as a brand because Lance Armstrong used it to win 7 Tours de France. He doped with it because EPO is a blood thickener. It gives you extra red blood cells. But Johnson & Johnson decided it would be perfect in cancer to serve as kind of a general pick-me-up to cancer patients. And it sold it as a cancer remedy, even though it knew that EPO is basically Miracle Grow to tumors. It is a tumor fertilizer. It makes tumors explode in growth. And yet, during the administrations of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, half of all cancer patients in the country were given this. And the reason this was true is that Johnson & Johnson found a way to legally pay off oncologists. So much so that the average oncologist during those years made about $300,000 from their practice. And then they made an additional $300,000 just by prescribing EPO. Johnson & Johnson basically doubled their income. And part of the way they did this was by a massive amount of insurance fraud. And William, you and I both know in investigating things that grand juries are basically the last truly secret institutions in American life. I was a White House correspondent for the New York Times. We would get secret documents about national security things, not irregularly. The New York Times, as far as I know, has not had a single grand jury document in 30 or 40 years. I have hundreds of these documents from 3 different grand juries. And what they show is that Johnson & Johnson paid off basically everyone in cancer so that they would use as much EPO as possible. And it's that reason that 500,000 Americans died, because the entire world of cancer was in on the scam.
Wow, it was corrupt. So then they can just blame it on cancer too. That's the thing. Oh, he must have died of cancer, not from EPO or Procrit or something like that. But you tell a story at the intro to the book, and it resonated with me because I was in a doctor's office, and these drug salesmen went in, and this girl came in. She looked like a model, and she was dressed to entice, I would say, as like large heels and a short skirt. And I was like, wow, this looks really corrupt. They put her into the back to the doctor right away too. And I sat out in front and waited. So I was like scratching my head, like, how does this make sense? And I think she had a bag, and she was she was sitting on pulling out like drugs. I was like, this doesn't seem right at all. And you talk about that, Jim. Yeah.
Sure. When you cover the industry, of course, you get to know a lot of these drug sales reps. And once you start seeing them, it's sort of like those movies about pod people. Like once you're able to see pod people, you see them everywhere. And it's like once you realize who the drug sales reps are, you see them absolutely everywhere in doctors' offices and hospitals and all the rest. And as you said, William, they are invariably incredibly attractive people. Now, every study that has ever been done on the consequences of drug sales reps show that they make doctors worse at their jobs, in some cases far worse at their jobs. And again, there is not a single one of these disasters that I document, including the opioid crisis, that would have taken place if not for the pervasiveness of those incredibly attractive sales reps. Because what they do is they bring their charm, they bring free drugs, and oftentimes they bring cash and food for these doctors and their staff. And at the height of the drug sales rep influence, some large doctors' practices would have these very complex schedules on the wall about which sales rep was bringing in the late morning snack. Another sales rep would bring in lunch for the entire staff from a gourmet place down the block. A third rep would bring in the mid-afternoon break snack. And so you would literally have these calendars of 15 different feedings for the doctors.
Wow, I had no idea.
Every week. And then, of course, they would often invite doctors to very fancy dinners at night at local restaurants. They would invite them to fill up their gas at gas stations where they would park themselves in front of a couple of gas terminals. And if you pulled up as a physician, you could fill your tank for free. Or they would go to a local Staples store, in the weeks before school opened, and they would be at a particular cash register. And if you were a doctor, you could come in with an entire grocery cart of school supplies and other things, and the sales rep would buy it all for you. You just had to stand there and listen to them give a 30-second pitch about their drug, and you would get all of these things for free. Same thing, you would get ticket to the Masters golf tournament, which just happened, Super Bowl tickets, NC2A, all that sort of stuff. And in the medical device world, this is still going on. You get tickets to Hawaiian resorts if you simply, use the device that this company is suggesting you use.
It's incredible. It's really incredible. When I got out of college, this is back in the 90s, that was a very coveted job, was to be this job. I didn't fit the mold, obviously, but it's a good paying job.
Oh boy, it's really good paying. And people, get not only a nice salary and bonus, but they get a car, a company car. They get all kinds of perks. They themselves get to go off to these resorts, usually on a quarterly basis, for these sales meetings. And William, the funny thing is that what happened is that the industry started buying the prescription numbers of every doctor in the country. So they knew exactly what doctors were prescribing. And it was when they started buying that kind of data that they could see what sales practices led to the biggest jump in prescriptions and sales, right? Because in the old days, you would sort of give a little gift to somebody, but you didn't really know whether the gift worked. Well, the companies quickly started to find out what worked, and they realized very soon that the gift that worked the best was cash. So in the old days, the sales forces were these very educated pharmacists who would try to educate on doctors. Well, what these data showed is that doctors didn't want education. They wanted very attractive people to give them money.
Wow, that's amazing. I had no idea about that, but it's still stunning to me that how calculating they are to do that.
Yeah. So Johnson & Johnson, which used to hire pharmacists for its sales reps, started hiring literal cheerleaders from the SEC. right?
Wow, that makes
Because
perfect sense. When I saw this woman, I thought she was an ex, like a gymnast or something,
no,
like
she
an
was
ex athlete or something. Yeah.
almost certainly a cheerleader, which, as you know, has become this extraordinarily athletic endeavor. So they're attractive, athletic, and they, as a result, get
Here's
their messages across.
it's probably majority females, but there was another guy I met who was a drug rep, and he would look like a volleyball player tanned. So there's probably a male component for the nurses. What that led me to believe is like
So
yeah.
so the other type that was big and still is are West Point graduates or recent retirees from the Army, Navy, young the captain's level.
Wow.
And in fact, Johnson and Johnson's longtime CEO, Alex Gorski, was exactly that type. He had gone to West Point. He had fulfilled his 5-year commitment, and when he came out, he became a Johnson and Johnson sales rep and rose through the ranks. And clearly oversaw obviously illegal schemes to sell many of these drugs in ways that he had to know would lead to an enormous amount of death and injury. But and I talked to a lot of these sales reps while doing this book, because in these grand jury records, the investigators got employee listings. So I had thousands of employees and their cell phone numbers and their addresses. And so I was able to talk to hundreds and hundreds of them, including some West Point graduates. And they, in retrospect, were shocked that they had been involved in such obviously unethical practices. Because, of course, when you're at West Point, you're taught ethics. It's a huge part of the education there, but so is following orders. And basically, these guys came out of the Army and came out of the other services, and they were very good at saluting. And it just didn't occur to them that the things that they were being asked to do were so unethical and wrong until they had been doing it for a long, long time.
The money's good. You're looking for money. You probably have some student loan debt or whatever. You're probably,
Sure.
so it's a good job if you fit the bill. That's how the book starts for people who don't know. So check out his story, Gardner's story about this woman at a bar, because I really identified, I was like, wow.
Well, it's a classic, as you know, it's William. It's the classic investigative correspondent. Like, you have one of these meetings that gets you to thinking, and you start digging and digging and digging. And that meeting was in 2004. And basically, I've been digging on this company ever since.
There's a lot there, guys. There's a lot more in this book. We are at the 47-minute mark, Gardner. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed?
No, I mean, to me, the reason to look at Johnson and Johnson is this great contradiction between it is, on the one hand, the most among the most admired corporations in the world. On the other hand, it is by far among the worst behaviors and is basically a criminal organization that has contributed to the deaths of at least 2 million Americans. So it's that contradiction. How is it possible? And look, I take I was to blame for part of this. I was one of the most important healthcare reporters in the country, and I couldn't get them. And I take the Wall Street Journal to task. I take the New York Times to task. I take a lot of other media to task for letting this happen. And so in many ways, this book is a kind of a mea culpa. I screwed up. The many places I worked at screwed up, and other places, and I'm hoping to set things right here.
Gotcha. And do you have a website?
I do. It's GardnerHarris.com, Gardiner Harris.com. And you can also go find me at LinkedIn.
So you're on LinkedIn. So if people want to follow up with you, the best place is to go to your website or LinkedIn. I will put links to the website in the show notes. But really fascinating book. Great job. Congrats on the book. A lot of information I didn't know about, so I'm just blown away. Like, I don't know the calculation is really what it is. Like, you see the kind of facade, but like the calculation and the brazen deception, just like on the title, is incredible. Again, the author is Gardiner Harris, Gardiner Harris. Full title of the book is No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson and Johnson. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
All right, stay there. Stay there.